Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. You might rightly be asking why you should listen to me. I am a designer. I am not a software engineer. I'm not a developer. What gives me the right to lecture to a room full of engineers? Well, I'm also an ethicist, and I've spent the last probably 6 or 7 years now working with technology teams to help them build more responsible technologies, more responsible and ethical products and services. Over that time, I've started to learn what goes right and what goes wrong in those teams. So I feel maybe I've got some interesting angles that I can report on, particularly around the ethics of engineering as a discipline. And I hope you'll be convinced that actually you can be partners in this emerging movement. There are going to be 2 halves to my talk today. I'm going to talk about why the software engineering discipline needs to take ethics seriously. And then for the second half, I'm going to talk about, well, okay, that's great, but how do we start? What do we do practically that changes that trajectory, that makes things different? I'm going to start our story today with a bridge. This is a particularly notable bridge because I think it tells us a lot about the role of technology in society. You'll see this bridge has 2 signs in front of it. The first one, the speed limit, ignore that. The interesting sign is actually the one much closer to it. It's very small, so maybe you can't see it at the back. But it's the clearance, it's the height of the bridge. It's 9 feet and no inches. This is a really low bridge. Back in 1980, a fellow called Langdon Winner, he's a political theorist and social scientist. He wrote a paper that's now become fairly famous, and that paper is called Do Artifacts Have Politics? And in this paper, he goes on to argue that this bridge was actually a tool of racial segregation. Because you see, this bridge was erected as part of the master plan of New York City, the master plan that was owned and executed by a guy called Robert Moses. He was essentially the chief architect, the chief urban planner of New York and the New York area in the middle of the last century. And we know quite a lot of things about Robert Moses. He was a well-documented figure. One of the things we know about Moses is that he was a racist. We have ample evidence of his bigoted views toward certain races and cultures. And Winner in this paper, he talks about, there's actually a biography by a guy called Robert Caro who wrote about Moses. And he says that, Caro argues that this bridge is actually evidence of Robert Moses' bias, his bigotry, that it was even maybe an intentional scheme to racially separate the city. And the idea is this is a bridge constructed over a highway leading from, I guess, Brooklyn perhaps, down to Long Island, which had some very desirable beachfront properties and beaches. Back then, as today, it tended to be the rich residents of the cities who had access to private transport, to their own cars. Poorer residents usually had to travel by public transit, and particularly buses. And of course, this bridge is so low that a bus simply will not be able to pass underneath. And so what the effect of this technology, I suppose, is that poor people can't use this road. They can't travel by bus because no bus can fit underneath it. So they're actually denied access to what's on the other side. Unless you own a vehicle yourself, you can't get to the desirable properties in Long Island. And of course, who is poor? In New York, as it is today, most of the time, or the correlation is stronger that it's usually minority ethnicity residents, black residents, and so on, tended to be less affluent than their white counterparts in New York. Again, not much has really changed there. So that account is a little bit debated, but whether it's intentional or otherwise, this ancient technology, this bridge, several tons of, stone and steel, I don't know how you make a bridge, but nevertheless, a very simple and inert technology promoted and enforced segregation and even bigotry in one of the most significant cities on the planet. And it's this understanding of how technology profoundly affects and shapes our world that prompted Melvin Kranzberg, the historian of technology, to write his famous 6 laws of technology. The first law says that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I want to look at this argument about neutrality because it's something that we hear about technology quite a lot, that, well, we just build it, and then it doesn't, it's not really our problem what people do with technology. We can't be held accountable for that. And there's one technology we hear this about more commonly than any other. We have a very famous quote, in fact, about the supposed neutrality of technology. We hear that guns don't kill people, people kill people. And perhaps from a particularly technical perspective, or if you're looking for a specific loophole, then maybe you can argue that's true. But it's a ridiculous argument. It's a joke of an argument because it omits a particularly crucial fact, which is that guns make it really easy for people to kill people. The technology changes human capabilities. It changes how we see others. If you pick up a gun, you start to see people as targets, as potential threats. If you pick up a gun, it changes how you perceive and how you can affect the world around you. You can destroy it. You can kill another person with a single push. Bruno Latour, who's a French philosopher who died just a couple of weeks ago, he argued that it's a mistake for us to look at the human and the technology as separate entities. Or to be more accurate, when they come together, they become something new. They become a hybrid, a combined actor. If you pick up a gun, then you become a gunman. You become profoundly dangerous in a way that you weren't just a few seconds ago. The person, not that dangerous by themselves. The gun lying on a table, not dangerous by itself. The combination, that combined actor, can have profound and terrifying impacts on the world. And so a bridge, a gun, these are very old technologies, and even these have significant impact on our world. Now, okay, the things we build today, of course, we hope they have a smaller impact, and certainly the intention is smaller than a weapon, a killing machine. But still, we therefore must have significant potential to impact the world, because the things we build are full of light and language and energy. And of course, digital technology offers us something quite new and quite unique, which is scale. We can reach huge numbers of people at very low marginal cost. If you build something that sort of catches fire and attracts a lot of attention, you could have 100 million active users within a year of operation. So I think technologists and software engineers, developers in particular, more than almost any other group of people, create the things of the future. And those things then change how we interact with each other, and indeed change how society itself functions. We get to affect who flourishes and who gets harmed by that future. We get to allocate power. We get to decide who gains power and who loses power in that new world. So I think as makers, our job requires that we have to ensure that those impacts are as positive as they can be. We can't get away with this excuse of neutrality, that this is not our problem. We have to bear that responsibility. We have to do something about it. And I think we're fumbling that responsibility as a community, as a profession. The tech industry over the last decade or so has spewed out a host of ethical mistakes and lapses and scandals. Just some of them you see here. I'm sure you're familiar with many more. And there's now a clear trend that the general public is losing faith, is losing confidence in the technology sector. On the left, you see some data from Pew Research, on the right, from Edelman's Trust Barometer, and they show a very clear trend, which is that confidence in our sector is at its lowest point in certainly a decade or so since these records started being taken, after notably a very high start. The general public used to really like our industry. They had a lot of faith in us to act in their interests. That is ebbing away. This is only 2020 data, but there's no evidence that things are rebounding, let's put it that way. And in fact, we've now reached the point where only 19% of the public, this is the British public who were surveyed by this poll, say or agree that tech companies design with their best interest in mind. 19%. That for me is a damning indictment of the ethical problems in our industry. It suggests that we have to do better. And so in recent years, there's been, maybe belatedly, but nevertheless, there has been, a tech ethics movement has started to flourish. Carly Kind has written about this, the good piece at the bottom there that I recommend you read. But she points out there have been 3 waves to this movement, if you like. The first wave is philosophical. This was essentially ethicists and moral philosophers saying, oh, it looks like you've got some ethics problems. We're pretty good at those. Let's talk. My consulting rates are extremely high because you're Google and you've got a bunch of money, but nevertheless, let's have that conversation. Then there's been a technical wave, and this technical wave has focused mostly on AI and machine learning, looking at the risks and the dangers of algorithmic bias. So this has been focusing on auditing those systems, auditing data sets, auditing training systems and models to make sure that they are as free of bias as is possible. You can never totally debias a system, but you can try and mitigate and reduce that bias. And then most recently, there's been a wave of tech ethics that has focused more strongly on social justice issues. This has probably been more prominent in the US, particularly since the killing of George Floyd and the BLM protests that followed. Of course, I'm not saying that Europe and other continents don't have a lot of social justice and racial issues as well, but I think that the focus has been the strongest in the US. And perhaps it's still the predominant wave right now. This movement is still very much in the ascendancy. But I'm going to argue that all of these are valid, and in fact, none of them is sufficient on its own. You need to take technical approaches, you need social and political perspectives that the social justice angle gives, but you also need philosophical perspectives. And essentially, converging on this space from those three directions at once is valuable and necessary. However, I know that talking about ethics is not always a popular thing. I know that some people are skeptical of the topic. Maybe even some of you in this room are skeptical about, well, why should I be responsible for carrying that burden? And generally, when I talk about ethics with technologists and with tech companies and leaders, I hear three common objections. The first is that ethics is subjective, that it's all a matter of opinion. You say this, I say this, how do we make progress? I think this is one of the biggest and most fundamental misunderstandings about ethics, the idea that it's all a matter of opinion, that you get to decide, I get to decide. Now, what is true, and I'll concede this, is it's not a science. There's no single truth that we can discover with the scientific method. But that doesn't mean that ethics is subjective. I also recognize this comes from a good place. There's actually an intention here that we look at history and we recognize that over the past, even just 100 years, a lot of the time, if you have a dominant group trying to impose a standard of how you should live and how you should exist, that's been dangerous. In fact, in some situations, it's been outright genocidal. So we should be careful, we should be cautious about the idea of imposing our standards, of forcing others to behave in our preferred way. We should be mindful of other cultures and perspectives. Ethics has to be sensitive to and to learn from those contexts and cultures. But ultimately, it has to take a point of view. It has to have a stance. If we agree, if we say that ethics is subjective, I decide what's right for me, you decide what's right for you, then we have to conclude that a slave owner gets to decide whether it's ethical to own slaves, which is nonsense. Of course, that's not an ethical thing to do. It is true that people can have different opinions on ethics, but it doesn't mean those opinions are equally correct. Bluntly, your opinion might well be wrong. So ethics is not subjective. I think maybe something that clouds this is that sometimes you get a moral question or an ethical dilemma that has a couple of equally valid solutions. So maybe it seems messy, it seems like it's a subjective matter of opinion as to which one you choose. But what I want to highlight is there are also thousands of wrong answers to that particular problem. And actually there is a lot more agreement about ethics than we might like to believe. Just look at something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has 50 or so countries with maybe a couple of billion citizens represented by those nations, agreeing fundamental aspects of what it means to be human and how we should treat that human being. So we need to reject this presumption. We need to be brave and accept that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and it's actually in our interests. In fact, it's our responsibility to advance that discussion. The second objection that I often face is that ethics is slow, that it's abstract, that it's difficult, that it's dead Greeks and abstract philosophy. And I don't think that's accurate. For me, ethics is vital and real. I mean, think, any of you who have children, you will know just how much of that early years education you do in training this small child is really training them on how to be human, how to treat others, teaching them the difference between the right way and the wrong way to behave. It's such a central part of what it is to be human. So I don't think necessarily this is something that is slow, that it is an imposition. This is something that we carry with us and should be innate within our decision-making every single day. I think ethics should accompany everything we do. It doesn't necessarily have to directly oppose it. It only should oppose the bad stuff. And candidly, I don't think most companies need chief ethics officers and a big ethics committee. These things don't scale. And really, you should keep them for the high-risk things. If you're building, automated weapons, or if you're doing AI profiling for police or for hiring algorithms or things like that, then sure, maybe you need that ethical infrastructure. But what interests me the most and what I think is the most powerful is to bring ethics directly into product, engineering, and design teams, because that's where the decisions with the biggest moral impact are being taken within tech firms. And when that happens, I don't think ethics is slow, I don't think it's obstructive. It becomes something we learn a little bit of and we try to integrate into our process. So in the second half of this talk, I'll give some tips on how we do that. The final objection I hear is that, well, if we're talking about doing ethics, we have to try and anticipate what's going to happen, what are the impacts of our decisions. But we can't do that. We can't predict the future. This is something we love to tell ourselves in this industry. And actually, this idea of prediction is particularly out of fashion right now. We've convinced ourselves that we live amid such flux, such change, that the best, actually no, the only way to build software is empirically, is to work in lean and agile ways that are all very incremental. You learn from small chunks of experience and trial and error. You build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, and you repeat that cycle. And this has led, I think, to a fairly common excuse that the impacts of technology, the bad impacts, the negative consequences, they were these unintended consequences. We never planned for them to happen. And perhaps that's true, but we've overlooked something quite significant. Unintended is not the same as unforeseeable. Ethics is not about trying to predict the future. It's just about trying to anticipate what could happen, what might go wrong. And it's true that you'll never get all of those. There is a law of unintended consequences that says that. You'll never spot everything, however hard you try. But you will, if you put the effort in, you will be able to spot some of the risks that are facing you. And you can mitigate them before it happens. And it's far better to get 50% of those, right? To anticipate some of those risks and to fix them, rather than to fix none of them. And until recently, 0% is essentially what we've done. We haven't tried to do this type of foresight and anticipation. We've argued that it's just not possible. But it's not true. There are methods that you can use. We'll discuss some of these later on as well. So we all have to start doing this. This is part of our role. This is part of our duty as professionals, as competent practitioners and engineers. Nevertheless, there are still some objections. There are still some companies that say, you know what, we're just going to withdraw from this altogether. Coinbase are the most famous example. You may remember this. It might be 18, 24 months ago now, something like that. But they wrote this blog post. Brian Armstrong, their chief exec, wrote this and said, you know what, we are no longer talking about politics or social impact or ethics at our company. The only thing you're allowed to discuss on work time is work, is the mission and the goal of the company and how we achieve that. And they even paid off staff. They said, if you disagree with this, we will pay you to leave. And 5% of the entire workforce said, yeah, that sounds good, I'll take that money and I'll leave, because they weren't comfortable with that decision. Shortly after that, Basecamp tried to do something similar. Again, there was a bit of pushback internally. But I think, particularly with the Coinbase example, there's a profound self-deception happening here. It's absurd for a cryptocurrency company to say we don't do politics, right? Because the entire sector is sharply political. It's founded off libertarian ideals of free trade, low regulation, low or preferably zero tax. Now, you can choose to believe in that stance politically or not. That's not really my role to judge. But I will say that it's laughable to suggest that that political stance has no ethical consequences. However much you might like to, you can't will the ethics away from technology. Your work has ethical impact, whether you intend that impact or not. And so the choice not to engage with ethics, well, guess what? That is itself an ethical decision. And it's a vote for the status quo. What you're saying is you're looking around you and saying, you know what? I'm happy with this. I like this direction. Let's keep it going. Now, personally, I look around me, not necessarily in this room, but in a broader sense, I look around me and I see lots of reasons not to pursue the status quo. There's so much that needs to change, I think. So let's move on. Hopefully I've convinced you that, it is our professional duty to start taking ethics seriously. The question then becomes how? What can we do to get started tomorrow, next week, next sprint? I'd like to offer you 5 practical tips that I think are probably the easiest steps, if you like, on that journey, the first rung on that ladder. The first is to make time and make space for this kind of ethical discussion. I've mentioned this empirical way we have of building software now, the lean and agile models. It links very much with the old Facebook motto, move fast and break things, which is a dreadful way to do ethics. Now, it's fine if the thing you're breaking is, like a photo interface. You fix it next sprint, whatever. But it's not fine if the thing you're breaking is someone's marriage or democracy, something like that. And some of these systems have had that kind of broad social and personal impact. So you have to find time to discuss ethics in your everyday work. Now, what I think doesn't work here is initiating an enormous program. Unless you're in one of those very high-risk industries, or if you're a very well-funded and large company, you're not going to be able to cram huge amounts of additional work into your process. I know how things go. But what matters is starting somewhere. So my suggestion is to make time and space within your existing processes, to look at existing rituals and habits and see what you can do to make them good vehicles, good conduits for ethical discussion. Obviously, you want to try and do that early in a project. The sooner you spot ethical harms, the sooner you can do something about them. So maybe if you have a sprint 0 or something else around project initiation, if you're making a business case for why we should invest in this particular new feature or refactor, when you're planning resources, when you're breaking down epics, that kind of thing, that's a really good opportunity to talk about the potential positive and negative impacts that you might have with that work. You might want to use retrospectives as well. Of course, there's a problem with a retrospective, which is that, it's retrospective, right? It's after the event. So, you can use those if you want, but what matters is, do you take that wisdom forward? You can reflect on what you could have done better in the previous feature that you've released or whatever it might be, but what matters is that changing how you operate from that moment on? One technique you can rely on here is something called a designated dissenter. This was identified by Sarah Octobetra and Eric Meyer. They wrote a book called Design for Real Life. And it's a little bit analogous to, if anyone knows the 6 thinking hats, Edward de Bono model, if you like. It's a bit like the black hat in that. So what you're doing as the designated dissenter is you're role-playing as someone who objects to the plan. Basically saying, I don't agree, we shouldn't do this, I've got a problem, and here's what that is. So you're nominating a colleague to role-play as that dissenter, which has 2 benefits. One, it will help you anticipate things that could go wrong, ways you might be harming people inadvertently with your decisions. And the second is it will help people build the experience of considering critical perspectives of a wide range of stakeholders. Because your work may well not go to plan. That little bit of skepticism that you train yourself to have if you wear the hat of the dissenter, that's a really good habit to have when it comes to ethics. One thing I want to stress here is you have to rotate this role. Partly this is to give everyone the chance to think that way, but the other reason, probably more importantly, is we know what happens to that one dissenter. If there's that one person bringing up issues again and again, eventually we know that they get rooted around. We start to not invite them to things. And that's not a helpful way to look at this problem. Now, one drawback of this is you're still role-playing this, right? It has some value, but there's a limit to it. You'll always be blinkered and blinded by your own perspectives and your own experience. So you should be pairing this sort of thing with sympathetic and careful research as well. Obviously, talk to your design research and product research colleagues about how you might do that. But nevertheless, this is something you can do to get started next week. You might also, in these sessions, consider different types of use. We've all seen persona decks that designers have created for your teams, and they all have smiling users who are thrilled to be using the product, right? There's a very positive interaction here. Their life is improved by using the product or the service that you've built. But of course, there are some users who want very different things. Not all use cases of technology are positive. So I call this a persona non grata. These are some sketches and some categories from Molly Claire Wilson. I think most of them are self-explanatory. Some are going to be more prominent for some types of technology. Stalkers and swarms are going to be common on social media. So here the swarm is essentially, a pylon, a bunch of, reply guys or whatever it might be, all harassing one individual. If you're working on, say, domestic IoT projects, then you need to be particularly alert to the abuse use case. Not how might, but how will people use the technology you've built to harass and frighten people in their own homes. The naif is an example of a newbie who makes a dangerous mistake. So this might be a kid who spends 3,000 euros on in-app purchases for a game, or a Twitter user who gets a credit card for the first time and posts a picture of it on Twitter because they're so proud of it, and then, of course, gives away all their financial information. So consider these not necessarily hostile actors, but these atypical or these not necessarily positive use cases as part of your planning and part of your mitigation efforts. And of course, now, these ideas are familiar to anyone who's worked in security. Understanding adversaries, understanding their capabilities, how they might try to attack a system, that's the fundamentals of threat modeling. It's a critical part of designing any secure or privacy-protecting system. So maybe even ask these folks to come in, even lead sessions if you have some of those skills. I'm really talking about this kind of red team model and expanding it to a broader set of ethical issues. So we set up some of these sessions, but now what do we do in these sessions? What questions might we ask? I think one reason that we've been historically kind of scared of ethics, or that we have been tempted to dismiss it as just a matter of opinion, is we really just don't know how to talk about it. We haven't, maybe there are some philosophy graduates, in the audience here, and if so, yeah, you're my crew, but generally we haven't got the training in this kind of thing. We're trained in science, technology, engineering, maths, whatever it might be. The good news is, of course, other people have done the work for us. So what we need to be careful of is not to fall into a very common trap that I see in the technology industry, which is of thinking that we are the first brave explorers of any new shores that we land upon. Because, of course, we're not the first people to think about these issues. There have been philosophers, critics and writers, artists, sociologists. These people have been looking at the potential impact of technology for decades, if not centuries in some cases. So we should use their knowledge. We should learn what they have to tell us. Now, of course, they range from the accessible to the utterly impenetrable. On my final slide, I've got a little reading list, so if you're interested, these are my recommendations for the most practically relevant authors on this topic for working developers, designers, and product managers. But what matters here is going beyond our hunches. We all have a kind of moral hunch and intuition that something might be right or wrong. And that's good that we have that. That's an important part of being ethical, but it's not enough. If it's just seen as, well, it's my hunch versus your hunch, then we know what happens here. The most senior hunch will win. So if you want to make a convincing argument when it comes to ethics, you have to go beyond this intuition. You need to justify why you think something is right or wrong. And we can start by asking some fairly simple ethical prompts, some moral questions. Well, the questions are simple, the answers probably aren't, which is good. That means you're probably getting somewhere if the answers are kind of messy and interesting. Don't worry, this isn't the place that I'm going to go deep into ethical theory. I think it's useful, and sometimes you might want to bring in a specialist to help you with those kind of things, but I do think you can start asking these questions yourselves. So here are 5 cheat sheet questions, if you like, based off the 3 main schools of modern ethics. The first, what if everyone did this? Would a world where everyone acted in this way, would that be a better place or a worse place? If it's a worse place, then why on earth do I get to do it? Maybe I shouldn't. Second, am I using people for my own ends? So basically, am I respecting other people as autonomous individuals with important goals, or am I using them just as a way for me to get what matters to me? And I see this quite a lot in data-driven companies, where product experimentation actually becomes experimentation on users, trying to persuade or manipulate them to behave in certain ways that make us more money. So this is, I think, one to watch out for in those kind of cultures. How would people judge me if this were headline news? In ethics, this is sometimes called the sunlight test. You know, you're shining a light on this decision. If everyone knew that it was me who chose that outcome, would they say I was a good person? Would they say I was virtuous and considerate and compassionate? Or would they say that I was scheming, deceptive, manipulative? Another one, sort of related, what matters most to me? What are the values that matter the most to me as an individual? How do I try to live my life? And then am I really doing that? Am I demonstrating those values? It's no good to say you believe in certain values unless you also live up to them. And then finally, this is called a utilitarian view on ethics. Am I maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people? And then by extension, am I minimizing harm, minimizing pain and suffering for as many people as I can? So these questions, I'm not going to go through in any greater detail, but I think they're useful. They can guide you. They can start that ethical conversation in a way that takes you away from opinion and gives you something a bit more robust and a bit more road-tested. Now, these aren't algorithms. You can't crank the handle and ethics sort of comes out, but they are lenses, right? They will shed light. They will help you see things in new ways and to keep that conversation going. Another thing you can do in these sessions is use what I would call risk mapping tools. And this is essentially starting with a bunch of known categories. You know, technologies tend to have certain similar risks. So there might be surveillance, disinformation, exclusion, whatever it might be. And so you can find a lot of decks and canvases and cards and so on that list out some of these prompt questions. The two I recommend the most are probably the Data Ethics Canvas from the ODI and an Ethical Explorer on the right. And these are both free tools. There are PDFs available. There might even be some physical copies of the Explorer. And these are robust. The great thing about these is people have done that hard work for you. So these are good, tested, well-considered questions and prompts that you can start to engage with without having the training. You don't necessarily need to be a skilled philosopher to handle this. Now, they have some downsides as well, of course. If it's just an existing list of questions, you might miss something. There might be something new that emerges, and it's not going to help you capture those risks. And sometimes, if you don't have the expertise in running these sessions, you can ask the questions, but you may not find the right answers, but you will improve over time. Right? You start to recognize more issues as you develop that habit, as those muscles get stronger, or your spidey senses start to tingle, right? There's something that feels wrong, and then this will help you probe into what exactly that is. Now, at some point, when you start doing this sort of work, eventually you realize you need to go a little bit deeper. And essentially, you realize you need some more documentation. And you're developers, so that's the great thing is I don't have to convince you of the value of documentation. You get it. What we're doing here is we're codifying common answers so that we can influence future decisions and so that we can reduce waste, so that we don't have to try and solve everything from first principles each time. So you can codify your ethical principles, put them in a document somewhere. Now, whether that's a standalone document, or whether it's part of your product or your design principles, or whether even it's part of your company's core values, I don't really mind where it sits. I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference. What matters is that you do the work. And you probably end up with something like this. This is PwC's attempt to codify their AI ethics principles. And you find pretty much every big tech firm now has published something like this, particularly when it comes to AI ethics. Google, Deloitte, Microsoft, and also government and NGO entities, OECD, the United Nations, all of these have something similar to this. And these sets of published principles can be very useful. When they're done right, they can act as almost ethical commitment in deep freeze. You're struggling with a tough decision, and you say, well, what have we said about this previously? You take that principle out, you let it defrost, and you apply it to your particular challenge, and it says, okay, pretty clear we need to go in this direction because we've made that decision previously. So it's a tiebreaker, if you like, for those tough questions. But these things can also be useless. If they're done poorly, they're a waste of energy. In fact, they're worse than that, they're dangerous, because they encourage you to think that you've solved the problem, right? We've documented this, so ethics is done. But if this document isn't helping you steer and influence decisions, then it has really no value at all. So of course the question becomes, how do we make these useful? In my opinion, the three big differences that separate a good ethics principle from a bad one. A good one is specific, memorable, and actionable. Or in philosophy, we might say action guiding. It influences how we act. Bad principles, well, they're the opposite. They're generic, they're forgettable, they're powerless, they're impotent, they do nothing for you. So I want to look at this. I want to look at this idea by going through a couple of examples. And I'm going to start with the most famous ethical principle that a tech company has ever published. Can anyone guess the principle that I'm referring to? Don't be evil? I think I heard don't be evil. That is the one I'm going to look at. This is the most famous ethical statement I think a tech company has ever made. Google get a lot of stick for this, right? It was actually a relatively throwaway line in an internal document, and then it sort of took on a life of its own, to the extent that it's now mostly used as a gotcha. When Google do something evil, it's like, well, what happened to don't be evil? Well, they actually got rid of it completely, and I support that, because this is a terrible statement. It tells you nothing. It's useless for practical ethics work. It's not specific, because what does evil mean? You need to give me some detail on, how do we decide whether something falls on that side or the other? The one thing it's got going for it is it's memorable. It's short, it's pithy, but otherwise it's useless. It's not actionable either. It doesn't guide us in any meaningful way. Really, all this statement says is, hey, ethics matters, which, maybe at some point Google did need that reminder. Some people would say they maybe still need it now, but still, this is not a useful ethical principle. Another one that you may know, do no harm. This is the core of what we know as the Hippocratic Oath. This is this ancient pledge that doctors and physicians used to take, or were asked to take going back to the Greeks even. Is this any good? Yeah, sort of. It's certainly better. It's a little bit more specific about what is bad, right? It's, rather than saying don't be evil, it's saying harmful things are evil. Harming another person is a bad thing. You shouldn't do that. So it's a little bit more specific. And it's also memorable, and it's sort of actionable. But in reality, we also need to balance this. In modern medicine, this isn't enough on its own. For example, if you're a surgeon and you want to give a cardiac patient a bypass operation to save his or her life, if you live purely according to this principle, you can't do it. Because the very first thing you need to do is make the incision and then, tear their ribcage apart to do that surgery. You'll be doing harm. So in reality, this has to be balanced. Physicians and bioethicists and so on have other principles, like acting in the patient's interests, in their well-being, promoting the patient's autonomy. What do they want to happen? And then promoting fairness. Who gets access? If you have scarce resources, hospital beds, surgeons, things like that, prioritizing who gets what according to who needs what the most. And then, of course, we have reams of medical codes and documents that go into more detail. So it's a decent start, but we need something, again, more specific and more actionable. And I think the way you do it is you prioritize two things, even over phrases and the reversibility test. And I'll just walk through what that means. So here's a principle that is fairly obvious. Some companies will say things like this, we believe customers really matter. And there's some ethics in this, a little bit. You're saying, okay, well, take customers' interests seriously. Don't screw them over. Recognize that they're important. The reversibility test, though, is if you flip a principle around, does it still make sense? Is it still a valid, viable principle for a different company at a different time? So let's have a look. We believe customers matter. Well, if we invert that, we're saying we believe customers don't matter. Would anyone ever say that? Is that a useful principle for a company? No, of course not. No one would ever say this. This is not a good principle because it fails this reversibility test. No one would be likely to say the opposite. So what this means is this is not specific enough. It's too generic. It's not going to guide action in any meaningful way. So we should rethink it. We should be a bit braver than this generic statement. We shouldn't be afraid of actually saying something. So here's what I think a good ethical principle might look like. This says something. User satisfaction comes first, even over growth. So that's that even over construction that I mentioned. But this also, I think, passes the reversibility test. It's specific. We can take it out of deep freeze and use it in an actionable way to guide our decisions. It's maybe not the most memorable. That's probably its weakness. It could probably be a bit pithier, a bit more exciting. But it's also reversible. You could see another company, or even your own company at a different time, could say, growth comes first, even over user satisfaction. Now, I don't like that company. I don't want to work for that company. But nevertheless, it's a viable strategy. There are some companies that have done that. So this is the sort of level of specificity that I think is useful when it comes to documenting ethical principles. Try to aim for something similar. My fourth tip is about, I think, a broader problem that ethics has. Ethics has a no problem. I mentioned before that ethics is seen as obstructive, as difficult. You know, it's the people who tell you you can't do the fun thing that you want to do. And okay, sometimes you need that, but certainly not every time. You don't need an antagonistic or oppositional stance for every decision. In fact, that's not healthy. It's not the way to get results. So I think we should learn different ways to say no and actually see saying no as a spectrum, not as a binary, not an on-off. And I would say it's maybe something like this, different ways that grow in force. Maybe we start with a query, a question. Well, why? Justify why you want us to do this. Help me understand, because maybe I'm missing something here. Isn't X a problem? Have you considered this? So querying the decision. The second is counter-proposing, is to say, I don't think we should do that, but here's what we can do that achieves similar goals and that does it in a way that I think we should be a lot happier with from an ethical point of view. And then right on the right-hand side, this is the outright refusal, right? This is the, I'm not going to do that. You cannot make me, this is beyond the line that I'm willing to go beyond. And I think ethics has this reputation that it sits over on the right-hand side here. It's folding your arms and saying no. Pardon me. And sometimes, sometimes it should be there, but not always. Now, I'm not saying what you do then is start on the left-hand side and escalate. I suppose what I'm saying is you match your tool to your circumstances. In essence, you do have to pick your battles. Sometimes it is better to concede the minor transgressions or the minor disagreements so that you can save your energy for when you really need it. But at each stage, whatever approach you take to saying no, what matters is that you refer back to your reasoning, the principles that you've documented as a company or as a team, the risks you've identified in your risk mapping work, or the ethical tests that we went through before. What are these telling you that you can use to justify why you're pushing back in that way? But this then brings me on to my final tip, it's stronger than a recommendation, actually. It's almost an urge. I want to urge you to try and stay safe while you do this. Because the elephant in the room when it comes to ethics is that, I can tell you from experience, it doesn't always make you the popular person in the room. Ethics can be risky. You can be putting your neck above the parapet and all these cliches. It can be a bit of an extreme sport at times. So it's imperative that you take steps to keep yourself protected as you raise these issues, as you get involved with this kind of discussion. So let's come back to this diagram and look at what happens as you start on the left and move toward the right. Well, the strength of your argument, the force of your refusal grows. Raising a query is a very small, it might push back the waves a little bit. A counter-proposal might work. But, a refusal, an outright flat refusal, is obviously a much stronger signal. And I think there's something really interesting here about developers. I think you're a special case when it comes to refusal. As a designer, if I say I won't do something, then I know what's going to happen. Eventually, my product manager is just going to say, well, I'll do it. I've got access to the design system. I've got a copy of Figma. If you won't, then I will knock it together. Now, it won't be any good because they don't know how to design, but nevertheless, they can and they will root around designers. Product managers can also get rooted around. Product managers, if they don't want to do something but their exec does, then the execs say, well, I'm going to put it on the backlog. I'm going to make sure this goes through. I'm the overall sponsor, and I'm going to overrule you. No one can root around developers. You have the monopoly skill on creation. No one else can build. If you lift your hands off the keyboard and say, we're not building this, well, guess what? It will not get built. So that means the strength of your refusal is actually surprisingly strong. It also has consequences, and I'll come back to that in the next couple of minutes. But I also want to look at the trade-off here. There's strength to your refusal, but there's also risk. And there's no big surprise here that the risk is highest if you outright refuse to do something. You're hired to do a job, and you're saying, I'm not going to do that part of the job. So usually you need some safety to do that. You need either some seniority to have built up that trust and that credibility so that people take you seriously and say, okay, all right, you win. Or even you need some money in the bank. You might fear for your job. You might say, well, maybe they'll fire me over this, but that's a lot easier to do if you've got savings, for example. So I'm hesitant to criticize someone who doesn't feel they have that comfort zone or that safety net, be it financial, be it social, inside the company, to stand up for what they think is right. I don't like calling individuals out in that way necessarily. But actually, I've omitted something important here. The other big challenge, or the big facet, the nuance to the ethical debate when it comes to developers, is there are tons of you. In any organization, there are going to be 5 or 10 times as many developers than there are product managers or designers. So yes, your refusal is strong, but the problem is if you say no, it's very easy to find someone else who will say yes. So on the rare occasions you must refuse, you actually bear a lot of risk, and the strength maybe isn't actually as pronounced as it is here. You take all the blame, and they'll just find someone else to code it anyway. So it's pretty obvious then what the answer is, right? It's collective refusal. If your whole dev team, or even your whole dev community says, we will not build this, we will refuse to make harmful technologies, then that's it. Then that's the debate settled. There is no way around it because you own the skills, you own the production of that code. And that gives you huge strength to that refusal. It all comes together to create something fairly overwhelming and unstoppable. But what happens to all the risk here? Does that follow the same pattern? Actually, no, it doesn't. It dilutes. The risk stays roughly the same, and you share that risk among you. So it actually reduces your personal exposure. They can't fire all of you if you decide collectively not to make something. So I think engineers, you find yourselves in this curious position where you have a good amount of individual power, but really if it's just 1 or 2 of you pushing for change, that's no good. There are too many people, they'll find someone else. So if you find allies, things change because you have vast collective power. So you need to share your concerns, you need to discuss ethics with your colleagues. Trust me, it's in your job description, even if you don't see it written in the text. But you will only win or lose collectively. You have to inspire others to come with you on that journey. In reality, it's messier than that, of course. It is sometimes hard to move in unity. You still need some people who are prepared to stick their hand up and go first, to be the spark that ignites a collective movement. So I'd like to close, if I may, with this. If you at some point find yourself in a position in your job, your career, in your community, where you're comfortable and safe and respected, and if you see something that you can't stomach, you think you have to stand up against ethically, I would urge you to take that risk. You're in the perfect position to use up just a little bit of that social capital to speak up and push for the change that we urgently need in our community. Because from where I stand, we still need all the help that we can get. So here's that reading list. I believe we're not taking questions, but I'll be around at the front and over the break, so please come and find me. Thank you so much for your time.